Chapter 13 First Love. In the year 1926, my sister came down from Newnham College, Cambridge, with an honors degree in classics. Now my father was in a position to continue meeting the cost of my education, and I sent in 2 or 3 applications to take a course at a teacher training college, which would qualify me to take up an appointment to a teaching post in a school like my father's. I was accepted by the principal of Sheffield City Training College and began to anticipate with rising excitement the activities in which I assumed I should now be taking part. Living in a community of adults in a social whirl such as my sister had often described during the past 3 years. In the vacations, I had become acquainted with some of her friends at Cambridge, who also lived in the Scunthorpe area, young men who in their public schools had been brought up in the knightly tradition, and who treated me with a courtesy which only contrived to emphasize to me my own gaucherie. I was still totally ignorant about the functions of the biological urges, which had begun to trouble me so much. To me, these temptations were associated with sin, and when I succumbed to them, I was miserable. The devotional books which had been given to me at the time of my confirmation reiterated that release from a sense of sin could only be achieved through confession and absolution. But I did not know anyone in Scunthorpe, except perhaps the Roman Catholic priest, who could have advised me on this matter. When I heard that there was to be a mission at the Catholic Church, conducted by a Franciscan friar named Brother Andrew, I decided to attend one of the meetings. I listened attentively to the sermon, with the argument of which I disagreed strongly, and as we left the church, I spoke to the brother and took issue about the point he had made. How can virginity be the highest calling for a woman, I asked, when Mary herself became a mother? The brother quoted to me various texts from the Bible to the effect that a married woman was too busy to attend to the things of God. Then he added, "You know, half the world's work is done by unmarried women." This was a novel point of view to me, and recalling some of the unkind remarks I had heard about unmarried women, I thought, well, some of them get small thanks for it. A year or 2 earlier, on one of his flint hunting expeditions, my father had met another enthusiast, when he had gone farther afield to Manton Common one day. His new friend was rector of the tiny village of Monton, and when we were growing up, his wife invited my sister and me to stay at the rectory for a weekend. The rector called himself an Anglo-Catholic, and he was able to explain to me the ritual of the sacrament of penance. After this, from time to time, I would cycle over to Manton to make my confession. The rectory was situated in the heart of a wood, which was carpeted with snowdrops in January. I would return home refreshed, not only by the ghostly counsel which the priest had given me, but by the picture which remained with me, of the green and white patches, of the snowdrops under the trees, or the seagulls wheeling behind the plough in the fields beyond, or the young larch trees in the hedgerow, festooned with spring green. I began my college career at Sheffield in September 1927. In the women's hostel, the students' rooms were cubicles opening onto a central corridor. The rooms of the first-year students were on the right-hand side, with their windows overlooking a green hockey pitch, surrounded by buildings. The second-year women slept on the other side of the corridor, and their rooms overlooked the road which ran down the side of the hostel. Each cubicle contained a bed, a desk, a couple of bookshelves, and a wardrobe. We of the first year also had a wash-stand, each provided with an old-fashioned ewer and hand basin, not for use as it turned out, but presumably because there was nowhere else to store them. In my room, as in the other freshers' rooms, there was a typed notice stating that water for the morning ablutions must be fetched from the bathrooms on the floor below. We did not know that this was an initiatory joke devised by our seniors. The girl in the next cubicle to mine was an early riser, and she was up and walking about before even the rising bell went. Seeing her pass my open door empty-handed, I called out, "Oh, I say, do be an angel and bring me some water back." If she had made this request to me, I should have replied, "Right you are, where's your jug?" But my neighbor merely opened her eyes wider behind her thick-lensed spectacles and said, "Who was your servant last year?" It was a moment before I grasped the significance of this cryptic remark. Each of the second-year students was responsible, as college mother, for the integration of one of the first-year students. My college mother was Margaret, a Sheffield girl. Her cubicle was directly opposite mine. After breakfast, on the first day of the term, we all hurried up the path which skirted the hockey pitch, on our way to the morning assembly in the main college building. Although we were a coeducational college, and as such considered rather advanced, the two sexes were required to occupy different sides of the assembly hall. After we were dismissed, the men proceeded by way of the right-hand corridor to their classes, while we went by the left-hand corridor to our own classes. The only lectures which were coeducational were the music lectures. As for that subject, the men's voices were needed in the choir. Somewhat discouraged by my first impression of college life, I yet looked forward to the dance, which was to be held in college on the first Saturday night. For one thing, I had never been to a real dance. At home I had been allowed to attend nothing more glamorous than a scout hop. Those of the other girls who were as eager to meet the male students as I was set off across the hockey pitch, under a crescent moon, to the college building. We were too early. There was nothing to do but sit in a row on the chairs under the windows and wait for partners to appear. But the men hung around in the shadows of their corridor, now and again coming to the threshold of the hall in bunches to look us over, and when the dancing did at last get under way, I found most of the men were even shyer than I was myself. Not one of them gave any indication of being the twin soul for which I was searching. I found the urban surroundings depressing also. The congestion of buildings, the noise of the traffic, the murk in the atmosphere, and I began to wonder how I could endure it for 2 whole years. I longed for the solace of green fields and hedges. On Sunday, having learned that there was a green park near the tram terminus, I tried to persuade some of my colleagues to accompany me on an afternoon walk, and when they declined, I decided to ask if I might borrow Matron's dog. He would at least be able to share my pleasure. This need for a companion who could share my aspirations was so desperate within me that before setting out on the walk, I went into my cubicle and shut the door. Then I knelt down and offered up a most urgent prayer. After a few moments, I rose to my feet, went downstairs and collected Mick, and left the hostel. We walked along the pavement in the pleasant autumn sunshine. As we were approaching the park, yet another tram went hurtling past us and drew up on the other side of the road. Only one passenger alighted, a tallish, slim young man, accompanied by 2 dogs. With his back towards us, he crossed the road and entered by the big gates. In my first glance at him, my heart had given a great leap, and it turned right over. At the entrance, the man stooped and loosened the dogs' leads so that they could run free. He went up the drive, and I followed, my emotions in a whirl at the sight of the back of his head, with its curling light brown hair. I had an almost suffocating feeling that this was my man, and I promised myself that by hook or by crook I would get to know him before I left the park. I had a sudden thought. Was this what my mother had done? Had she marked down her man when he boarded the Liverpool train at his village station? If so, this was a happy augury. I had no cloak with which to entangle him, but I must effect an introduction by some means. Then, with another flash of recollection, I remembered my prayer. Dare I assume that this was an immediate answer to it? Did God really intervene so promptly in such intimate and personal matters? The thought that it might be so filled me with awe. This man, whom I simply must meet, was now well ahead of me, throwing the ball for his dogs to chase. They bounded joyfully to fetch it for him, and as he turned to recover it, I was able to see his face. He was not really handsome, but his face had an attractive boyishness about it, and he seemed to be full of vitality. This was my kindred spirit. Trying not to make my intention obvious, I stalked my quarry. We had now come to an uncultivated part of the park, where a wide path led beside a little lake. Here the grass was rough, and since no flower beds intervened, the boy could throw the ball further afield. The dogs leapt to catch it. Then one of them missed a catch, and the ball dropped into the lake. He urged the Airedale to retrieve it, but both dogs hesitated on the bank, reluctant to enter the water. Here was my opportunity. I hurried up to them and said, "Excuse me, shall I send Mick in for the ball?" The boy gave a slight start, and then replied, "Oh, that's very kind of you." The ice was broken. When the ball was duly recovered, it followed as a natural sequence that we should walk together towards the exit from the park. For a time the conversation was rather one-sided. He asked me if I lived in the neighborhood, and I told him that I was a student at the training college, that I was training to be a school teacher, and that my home was in Lincolnshire. I also told him my name, adding, "What's yours?" "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings," he said. "This man is crazy," I thought. I said aloud, "I don't know what you mean." "You don't know what I mean," he echoed, with an exaggerated expression of shock. "You're going to be a school teacher, and you don't know what I mean. Have you never heard of the Golden Treasury?" "The Golden Treasury is one of our set books," I retorted. "What's that got to do with it?" My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, he repeated. Look on my works, ye mighty and despair. Ah, I see, I said. That's a quotation from the Golden Treasury. I must look it up when I get back to college. My anonymous companion, with his 2 dogs trotting beside him, walked back with me to the college gates, by which time, having elicited the information that we were not allowed out of the hostel in the evenings, except on Saturdays, when we were required to be in again by 10 o'clock, he had diffidently invited me to go out to lunch with him the following Sunday. He regretted that he had no means of transport except a stink wheel, but was pleased to offer me a pillion seat on that, and suggested that we should find an inn on the Derbyshire moors, with a good cuisine and a feast of views, such as, he assured me, would be infinitely more majestic than any that a Lincolnshire landscape could offer. I went into the hostel with my senses reeling. First, there was the realization of the stupendous fact that I had received an instant response to my spiritual SOS. Then there was the recurring memory of the personality of my new friend, educated, where my probing had failed to discover, witty, boyish, open-airish, entirely compatible. I sought out Margaret and told her that I had met a young man in the park, with whom I had arranged to spend the following Sunday. She expressed anxiety. The fact that he had withheld his name was to her cause for suspicion. Did the young man live in Sheffield? I had no idea. Would it not be a very risky thing to do, to go out with him on his motor bicycle, when I knew absolutely nothing about him? Well, I said, I could take a note of the registration number. That wouldn't be much help, commented Margaret pessimistically. If you were dead, I had an idea. I tell you what, I exclaimed. When I go to meet him on Sunday morning, you come too. Follow me at a distance on the other side of the road, and then cross the road as if you were a stranger, and make a note of the number. Then if he does murder me, you'll have the necessary evidence. So it was that about 11 o'clock on a lovely Sunday morning, early in October, in the year 1927, 2 young women came out of the same gate in Collegiate Crescent, Sheffield, parted, and walked up the road on opposite pavements, as if they were not on speaking terms. Bonfires of fallen leaves in the gardens of the houses were still smoldering after their owners' Saturday afternoon gardening activities, and here and there a thin blue wisp of smoke floated heavenwards like a wreath of incense. The sunlight gleamed on a roadway still wet with the early morning rain. The boy, I had no other name for him, was waiting at the crossroads, sitting astride his stink wheel, and I greeted him shyly. The footrest was adjusted, the starting pedal stamped on, the chugging speed reduced, and we were snaking away, soon to go zooming up the hill, past the people on their way to church, and feeling quite wicked on this account, up towards the tram terminus, and out onto the moorland road. By early afternoon we were walking along a valley beside a river. My heart was singing, in gratitude for the golden green of the grass, and the russet red of the hedgerows, and the joy of the boys' companionship. The valley narrowed. An elderly clergyman and his wife were approaching us from the opposite end of the dale. As they passed through the little gate, I thought, half triumphantly, half pityingly, how they must envy us, and I wondered if they were retracing the steps of their first walk together, as maybe we should do 40 years hence. The river flowed on our left-hand side. The bank on the far side of it was a long cliff, profusely covered with trees, whose leaves were changing color, and rowanberry bushes, and clumps of guelder rose berries. We sat on the grass facing this bank, and the boy told me a little about himself. He lived in lodgings in Sheffield. His father was an official in government service in India, and his parents came home from time to time on furlough. He was studying for an examination which would qualify him to begin to be a solicitor. He teased me again about the Osmondius quotations, and I replied with some others which I had specially prepared. He told me how during the summer, when he had been passing a village school, he had stood under the open window and heard the teacher scolding the little girls because they had forgotten to bring their thimbles. We walked on again, and he pointed out the trout lying as if asleep on the bottom of the stream, and told me the names of the different water birds, which spoke now and again from among the reeds. We came to a narrow neck between two wider stretches of the river. Here the water was so clear that it seemed bottomless in the shadow of the bank, but further on the stream opened out again, calm and vivid with autumn reflections. I wished I could have some of the berries to take back to college and put in the biology laboratory, and the boy said, "There are stepping stones further up the dale. We could go over and get some berries." We found the stepping stones. Crossing them was another adventure, but we managed it without mishap. On the other side of the water there was a path to the left, parallel with the path we had walked along, but tangled with briars and nettles and hemlock stems. The berries grew higher up the bank, so we left the path and went rustling through the fallen leaves, as though we too were all alone in the world. The boy gathered an armful of the choicest berries for me. By that time we were both hot and tired, and so he spread his mackintosh on the ground, and we sat side by side in the green arbor. Soon I was learning that there is more to kissing than mere amusement. His kisses were sweet, but I withheld the response I longed to make, for fear that I might appear to be pursuing him. We sat together for a long time. Then we were suddenly aware that the silence and the dimness of our surroundings were due to more than the shade from the trees. Dusk was upon us. We scrambled to our feet and made our way to the path at the foot of the cliff. I dreaded the thought of crossing the stepping stones in the half-light. The boy left them behind us, however, remaining on the same side of the river and turning along the overgrown path. He strode ahead, beating down the brambles as he went. Suddenly something flew at me, and I ducked. It was only a bat, but when a moment later an owl with wide wingspan swooped just above my head, I gave a little shriek. The undergrowth was now becoming thicker and the air mistier, and my spine was crawling with fear. We came to the place where the river narrowed, and where, in the sunshine, a few hours earlier, we had stood looking down into the water. The opposite bank was very near, but who knew what lay between? A golden edge of moon, now climbing up over the top of the cliff, shed a light onto the water. The boy spoke. "There's only one thing to be done," he said. "I shall have to carry you across." "No," I exclaimed in panic. "You might be drowned." He was already taking off his shoes and socks and turning up his trouser legs. The bank overhung the stream, and as he lowered himself into the water I could hardly bear the suspense. What should I do if the water closed over his head? Before I had recovered from my momentary distress, he had crossed the stream, deposited his shoes and socks on the bank, and was back on my side, looking up from the water. "Come on," he said. "It'll have to be by fireman's lift." My heart swelled to bursting point as I lay across his shoulder, looking up at the hunter's moon, now high and round in the heaven. As we sped along the empty roads on our way home, the moonlight silvered the gray stone walls and cast rippling lines of black shadow on the hummocky roadside. Then we were back among the lights and tram cars, and as the hour struck 10, gliding down the road which led to the hostel door. As we passed, the boy was shocked to note that every open gateway en route sheltered a couple of students, locked in a farewell embrace. He saw to it that we observed the conventions. Chapter 14. Idle. I lived in a cloud for the next few days. On Tuesday, a letter arrived in the mail, addressed in black ink, in a legal style of handwriting, and signed, disappointingly, Lloyd George. The writer expressed his appreciation of the pleasant time he had spent with me on the previous Sunday, and hoped we might repeat the procedure during the forthcoming weekend. On Friday I received another epistle, signed Winston Churchill, suggesting that we should meet for tea on Saturday afternoon and go on to a cinema afterwards. So after our hockey match, I rushed to change my dress and arrived at the rendezvous at the hour prescribed. By the time we had found an acceptable cafe, it was almost ready to close. We were the last customers, and Ronald, his name had now been revealed, teased me in schoolboy fashion for my addiction to cream buns. We had to join the Saturday night key before we could obtain cinema seats. Then we watched a silent film with musical accompaniment on an instrument called the panatrope. On Sunday, we sallied forth on the stink wheel again, riding through the mist to the village of Ashopton, where we sat in the inn lounge, in red leather armchairs before a blazing log fire. After lunch, we went exploring the Derwent Dams, a series of lakes set in cultivated park land, where the beech trees were still covered with crisp, crackling brown leaves. Here, shrouded in the mist, we kissed again, and soon my emotions were in a turmoil, but I was unable to relax, being beset by a sense of guilt. The mist turned to rain, and so, after a cozy tea at the Ashopton Inn, we mounted our snorting steed and splashed home again. The anticipation of our next encounter kept my senses glowing throughout the week. But a crisis intervened. On Friday, I had sudden bad news from home. My mother had been operated on for cancer, and my one thought was to get home for the weekends. This put an end to the excursions into Derbyshire, and when Ronald wrote to say that immediately after Christmas he was going up to London for extra coaching, preparatory to taking his law examination, I thought our brief idyll was over. In the new spring term, fettered by the stone walls and frustrated by the restrictions of hostel life, I began to feel desperate again. I wondered how country girls who were so unfortunate as to be found guilty of crime managed to endure prison life without going mad. I had an urgent need to get out of the town. It was the practice of the young men and women in the area to go about in droves, touring the countryside on foot and on push bicycles, more I assumed in order to release their superfluous energy than to enjoy the beauty of nature. I shrank from this form of exuberance, swooping up and down the mountain roads, noses glued to handlebars. My moments of delight could be won only in solitude, or in the company of a fellow spirit like Ronald. But I decided that when I went home for the half-term holiday, I would bring my bicycle back with me, so that I could, on occasion, at least get into the country. One glorious Sunday in March, then I set out for the village of Harthersage on my bicycle, taking some sandwiches with me on my meager pocket money allowance. A hotel meal was out of the question. I came home after a happy day, with arms full of branches of pussy willow. During the previous week we had had a lecture in an English period on the structure of the essay. Now, in my eagerness to share with others the memory of my happy day, I wrote an essay called Cycling, but instead of handing my work in as an exercise, I sent the effusion to the editor of a Sheffield daily newspaper. Every day during the next week I read the college copy of the journal from cover to cover, in the hope of finding my article reproduced. Then I forgot the incident. One day, a couple of months later, I received a letter from the editor of the paper, thanking me for my literary contribution, and enclosing a check for 12 shillings and 6 pence. I was wildly elated. At the first opportunity, I rushed down to the editorial offices, and searched through back numbers of the paper until I found my essay incorporated in some paragraphs on the women's page. I felt that this success gave me a legitimate excuse for writing to Ronald. I began by telling him that, now that spring was on the way, I could imagine the little beech trees at the Derwent Dams, sprouting leaves of a delicious green. Towards the end of the letter, I mentioned casually that I had received a modest check for an essay which I had sent to the editor of the Sheffield paper. Ronald responded immediately. My reference to the trees at the Derwent Dams, he said, had filled him with nostalgia in the hubbub of London. He rejoiced to inform me, however, that he would be back in Sheffield on such and such a date, and would be by then, he hoped, properly qualified to begin following his profession. "What is this?" he asked, about a check from the editor of a well-known newspaper. Was I asking him to believe that I had written an article which had been accepted, and this at my first attempt, when a number of his friends, and of the male sex, had been writing to the papers for years, and had never yet had an acceptance? He would be glad to know the title of the article, and the date of issue of the paper in which it had appeared. we could discuss the matter on the occasion of our next meeting. When this opportunity came, on the first Saturday of the summer term, he expressed an incredulous admiration for my achievement. That evening we strolled together up a hillside bordered with flowering cherry trees, past cottages where the countrymen were busy beautifying their gardens. Ronald asked if he could buy a bunch of pansies for the lady, and an old man pulled a fistful of the velvety, sweet-smelling flowers, but would accept no more than 2 pence for them. On the Sunday we went by train to Grindleford, and after lunch set out to follow a path alongside a stream, where I was enraptured by the sudden sight of a clump of marsh marigolds. The path led in a circle round and back to the village station, and some hours later we were standing on the platform waiting for the train, when recalling the picture of that patch of gold bobbing on the water, I said, "How lovely those marigolds were." "Hold this a minute," said Ronald, thrusting his coat into my arms. "I'll be back shortly. Don't go without me." Before I could reply, he was out of the station and lopping off down the country road. I guessed his intention and feared we should miss the train. It was at least a quarter of a mile to the gate by which we had left the road, and the train was almost due. Soon it was hissing in the station, and I was holding open the door and assuring the guard, whose whistle was in his mouth, that my friend would be back at any moment. At last he came hurtling onto the platform, holding out his armful of gold, and my feelings almost overcame me. That summer was an unforgettable one for me. Every Sunday we left the city, bound for some Derbyshire beauty spot. Bakewell, Matlock, Millersdale, Hope, Idale, Castleton, Haddon Hall, and in each place we would delight in its beauties, and gather its riches, and accumulate memories. Once, when we were picnicking in a field of primroses, Ronald put down his lighted cigarette on a clump of earth. In a few moments tiny ants were clustering round it, ejecting little spots of moisture. "Look!" exclaimed Ronald in amazement. "They are trying to put the fire out." One drizzling day we were walking near Hope, when the rain became more penetrating, the only shelter within sight. On the grassy hillside was a cow shed. We ran to it, and seeing a ladder against the wall, climbed up it to the loft, and had our picnic among the sweet-smelling hay. While we were up there, a boy drove some cows into the shed below, and we peeped at him through a knot-hole in the floorboards. If he had looked up to see an eye watching him, he might have fled in terror. When the rain stopped, I took a bottle down to the peaty brook and filled it with water, which I carried back to the loft to mix with lemonade powder to quench our thirst. Once seeing some boards lying flat on the ground, we inquisitively removed them, and found that they covered the opening to an underground tunnel. Ronald picked up a small stone and let it drop down the shaft. It seemed as if several seconds elapsed before we heard the plop of its landing, and when Ronald said, "I wonder where I shall be when that stone next sees the light of day. My heart contracted with emotion. On Sunday evenings it was pleasant to sit on a grassy bank and hear the church bells in the village calling the people to evensong, pealing across the fields in competition with the call of the cuckoo. On one such occasion I asked if I might try to ride the stink wheel down the narrow lane. Ronald gave me the necessary instructions and ran beside me for a little way. Then, seeing that I had got the right idea, he stopped running and stayed to chat with one of the local lads, who was out for a walk. I was pleased with my own prowess in managing the heavy machine, and enjoying the bird song and the sunshine. I could hear the voices of the two men distinctly, funneled down between the high banks on each side of the lane. Then, in negotiating a curve, I swung too near the other side of the road, and realized that I was going to crash. Without any regard for the scratching of my bare legs, I contrived to fall in such a way that the precious cycle ended up leaning safely on the bank. I heard the countryman say, "She's off," and an exclamation from Ronald. Then the pounding of footsteps reverberated on the tar macadam. I sat trembling on the bank, anticipating a flood of solicitous inquiries after my welfare, but Ronald leapt round the corner exclaiming, "What a damn silly thing to do! Why on earth did you fall off?" And it was only after he had felt his mount tenderly all over and found nothing wrong that he expressed a word of concern for me. Then, seeing my quivering lip, he said apologetically, "Are you all right?" During the week which followed, I received a letter from Ronald, in which he apologized for his boorishness and told me how much he enjoyed our outings. He feared that I did not derive so much enjoyment from them, bouncing about on the pylon seat of the motor-cycle, sprayed with the tarry grit from the road, and wondered if I would not rather be attending an orchestral concert, for instance, in some provincial Albert Hall. I assured him in return that I lived for the weekends, as indeed I did. Each Sunday before we parted, I would pick a wild flower for him, a primrose, anemone, cowslip, moon daisy, toad flax, or an ear of wheat, or sprig of rowan berries, and when we met again the following Saturday, he would still be wearing the faded flower in his buttonhole. I was beginning to discover more about the boy's background, and what I did discover made me feel sad. Born in India, he had been sent home to be expensively educated at a famous public school. It grieved me to realize that English parents involved overseas in the administration of distant parts of the empire were thus deprived of the joy of watching their sons grow up, their children in turn deprived of the anchor of home life, were perhaps required to endure the greater sacrifice. Ronald told me how at holiday times he either had to stay at school or go to visit relatives. He had never been able to embark on exciting adventures with his cousins for fear that his conduct might be construed as naughtiness, and evoke the threat that he would have to spend the next vacation at school. In telling me this, Ronald was not making a complaint, he was merely stating a fact. One summer Saturday afternoon, Ronald announced, "We are going to the dogs tonight." I was rather alarmed, until I discovered that he was talking about a greyhound race meeting. "Daddy, wouldn't approve, I said. We stood among the crowds round a wide cinder track and watched the powerful long-legged dogs lope round the track in pursuit of an electrically propelled hare, which disappeared through a trap door in the fence just as the leading dog was about to seize it. On either side of me there were men with hands full of old racing programs, with the names of some of the dogs heavily underlined. I asked my neighbor why he kept referring to these old programs. To find the form, he said. The form, I asked, puzzled. Which dog is likely to win? But why don't you look at the dogs to decide that? I asked. This is the scientific way to do it, he replied. The men in charge of the dogs, which were entered for the next race, were now parading round the track at a walk, with their charges trotting on the lead beside them. I studied the dogs, noting their characteristics, and then I said, my guess for the next race would be number 4. My neighbors consulted their programs. Number 4 hasn't a chance, they said. The runners were now in their cages, waiting the signal to be off. The next moment, the greyhounds appeared to be flying round the track, while the crowds hollered for their favorite to win. Number 4 won, and my companion whistled. Why didn't you have a bet on it? He asked. I turned to Ronald. Can I put 6 pence on the next race? I said. My goodness, what would your father say? He replied. I selected my dog. The runners were already in their cages when I gave my 6 pence to the bookie. 2 minutes later he was handing me back half a crown. That evening I went home the richer by 7 shillings and 6 pence. That was not the only reason why I cherished the memory of the visit to the dogs. I found that Ronald, like my father, was happy to chat with anyone nearby. A young couple came to stand beside us. They had brought the baby with them, and Ronald was captivated by it. Look, he said to me, he has everything in miniature. Look at these miniature fingernails. They're perfect. I still did not know anything about the mechanics of birth, which it was not nice to talk about, but it made me feel happy inside to know that Ronald would be an appreciative father. One Saturday, at the beginning of June, I suggested that we should go to my home. We had met immediately after dinner, and with luck I could be back again by 10 o'clock. We'll have a shot at it, said Ronald. So we set out, rattling over the tram sets and through the industrial areas, humming along country roads, past fields fragrant with the scent of the May blossom in the hedgerows, down the long, straight, empty roads in the Isle of Axholme, over the river, and up the new Doncaster Road to Theodore Road. When we arrived, I was pleased to note how well the blue delphiniums and the pink rambler roses in the garden set off my architectural creation. Mother and Daddy, taken unawares, were nevertheless delighted to meet Ronald and make their own judgments, and Ronald was equally charmed with Mother and the old boy. There was no time, alas, for me to walk with him in the nearby hemp dikes, or among the bracken on the Fox Hills. Immediately after tea, we had to be up and away again on our homeward journey. On the way we had a brief interlude before returning once more to the noise and the smoke, leaving the motorcycle beside a gate and walking through a field to talk to two great dappled Shire horses, which stood nodding sleepily under the trees. Here we lingered a while, where the fading hawthorn petals fell on us like snowflakes. Then onward again, trying to beat the clock, but 10 o'clock struck, and 10:30. It was 20 minutes to 11 before I was let into the hostel by a disgruntled maid. In the well of the staircase, I saw the faces overhanging the banisters. "Where on earth have you been, P.T.? V.P. wants to see you. She won't half be mad." V.P. was the vice principal. P.T. say you had a puncture. I went and knocked at the door of V.P.'s study. "Come in," said a voice. I entered, looking appropriately contrite. "I'm awfully sorry to be so late," I said. "My friend drove me home to Scunthorpe on his motorcycle, and it took us longer than we expected." V.P. smiled. "Well," she said, "if you decide again to go for such a long journey, see that you give yourselves more time. Some of us like to get to bed earlier than this. Good night." "What did she say?" clamored the girls on my corridor. "Did you get a roasting?" "No," I replied. "I really think she was grateful to me for telling the truth." Chapter 15. Acidulated Spinster. Although I did not blazon abroad the story of my friendship with Ronald, some of the girls were aware of it. Agnes, who occupied the next cubicle to mine, Margaret, my senior, and Irene and Catherine, who sat at the same bench in the biology lab. Nothing would have induced Ronald to enter the hostel gates. He said he wasn't going to be looked over by a penful of giggling girls, but he would sometimes bring me to the gates and wait across the road while I ran inside to spruce up, before we went to church, for instance. Then perhaps one of the students who had just got off the tram at the corner would announce, when she came upstairs, "Hurry up, P.T., your boyfriend's waiting. He's nearly ready. I saw him cleaning his shoes with his handkerchief." The depression had now begun to make itself felt, and Ronald saw little prospect of advancement in the profession he had chosen. In his next letter he asked me to bring my sewing kit with me on our weekend expedition, as he wished to learn how to sew on a button and darn a sock. So on the following Sunday we sat on the grass in a dell near Castleton, and I gave him the necessary instruction. He found that the sewing on of a button required such concentrated effort that he had to stand on his head afterwards to release the tension. "Why this sudden interest in feminine skills?" I asked. "Well," he answered casually, "I've come to the conclusion that there's no future for me in this country, and I've decided to immigrate." My heart dropped, and I waited for more. "I'm thinking of going to Canada," he said. "The wide open spaces, you know." "To Canada?" I echoed forlornly. "Why, that's half a world away." We packed up our knapsacks and began to walk up a bleak moorland road. It seemed now to be a raw cold day, and the country round us had become desolate. Ronald drew my attention to an opening in the rocks a few yards away, across the bracken. It looked like the lip of a cave, but the opening was so narrow that to get inside you would have to lie down and slide in. This was an invitation we could not resist. We wriggled our way in and sat down, laughing to find ourselves so snugly protected from the weather. I lay down, resting my head on the knapsack, and Ronald leaned over and kissed me. Then he whispered, "I should love to see you without your clothes." The shock of this remark made me tremble, not with fear, but with some strange new feeling. I was amazed to hear myself saying, "I think I should like it too." "Darling," said Ronald, joyously, and he held me close for a moment. I slipped out of my clothes and lay down on the raincoat beside him. "Why, darling," he breathed, "you're beautiful," and he folded me in his arms. In the cave, I was struck again by the desert island feeling of remoteness and yet of intimacy, as though we two, alone in the world, occupied a tiny space that was all our own. I clung to him with a passionate sense of belonging. Was I in love? Irene and Catherine told me that I was, but how was one to know for sure? The question came up repeatedly in the correspondence columns of women's magazines, and the answer was always the same. When you are truly in love, my dear, you will not need to ask. You will know. I did not know, so presumably I was not in love. Ronald and I were separated before the end of July, not, I rejoiced to know, by the Atlantic Ocean, but by the whole width of England. On what we assumed was our last Sunday together, he gave me a parting gift, which he said I was not to open till I got home. It turned out to be a little golden half-sovereign, with a note telling me to buy something I should really enjoy, to remember him by. I bought a box of expensive face powder, because I thought that was what he would like. I had never had a box of face powder before. He had been transferred to a solicitor's office in the heart of industrial Lancashire, and wrote and described the surroundings. He had lodgings in a little house whose interior walls were so thin that the noise of the blaring of the radio, which was kept persistently switched on at full strength, could be heard all over the house. Mother invited Ronald to come and stay with us for the long bank holiday weekend. I had organized a jumble sale in order to raise funds to take my wolf cubs to camp, and Ronald enjoyed himself immensely, presiding over the stall selling overcoats and underwear. The family made no romantic assumptions about our relationship, and he seemed to be very happy with us. Soon it was autumn again, and my second year at college had begun. It behooved me to work harder in order to complete my course successfully, but Ronald found the Rawtenstall environment so depressing that he was prepared to make the long journey to Sheffield each week to enjoy at least a Sunday on the moors, and we took up the threads of our friendship again, motorcycling over the Pennines in the dark, and the rain was no fun for him. So we now came generally by train, and we had to visit places which were accessible to the main train line. We would say goodbye to each other at the station, and then board trains going in opposite directions. Once, as he ran alongside the carriage, when my train was moving, he called out, "There's a long tunnel on the way. Don't be frightened, darling," and I was glad that the carriage was empty and I could weep unashamedly. When we met one Sunday towards the end of November, Ronald had a surprise for me. He had bought a little brown puppy in the market the night before to take back as a companion in his uncongenial lodgings. He said we would take it into the country with us on the motorcycle, which he would leave behind in the garage in Sheffield in the evening. So I sat on the pylon seat again, with the little dog cuddled in front of me, wrapped in the haversack. We were soon speeding on our way to Grindleford. Of happy memories. We had not gone far when Ronald pulled in to a hotel on the main road, saying we would stop there for coffee. Here, to our surprise, or at any rate to my surprise, we met his uncle and a girl cousin. This was the first time I had met any of Ronald's relations, and his uncle, who lived in the Sheffield area, told me that he hoped I would have dinner with the family one evening soon. We cycled on to Grindleford and had lunch at an inn with a red-tiled floors and draughty passages. Ronald had a bad cold, and he grumbled because all they had on the menu was cold roast beef, followed by rice pudding. I had to eat too much rice pudding in my nursery days, he said. It was a typical November day, shrouded in mist, with spotted sycamore leaves skidding to the ground from the dripping trees. Ronald spread his ground sheet on the green verge by the roadside, and we sat down to talk. We were carrying on a desultory conversation when, after a short pause, Ronald said, "Well, when are we gonna get married?" I was shocked and outraged. When are we gonna get married? That was not the way to woo. This casual assumption was too crude to be even acknowledged. I could be offhand, too. "Oh," I said, "I can't get married yet. Mother and Daddy have sacrificed a great deal in order to give me the chance to become a teacher. I shall have to teach for a time first." "Mother and Daddy," he echoed. "Where do I come in?" "You're too sorry for yourself today," I said impatiently. There was a pause. Then Ronald said, "All right, you'll probably grow up to be an acidulated spinster." I caught my breath with a gasp. An acidulated spinster? What a horrid expression! I stood up with dignity, disregarding the hint of a twinkle in his eye. "Thank you," I said. "You will have to go home by yourself, because I certainly shan't come with you." "Oh, I say," he exclaimed, jumping up. "You'll have to come. There's the puppy, you know." "I don't have to do anything," I replied, and I turned on my heel and set off up the road. I plodded along the road against the rain, forcing myself not to turn and look behind. After 5 or 10 minutes, I heard the motorbike revving up. If he slowed down beside me, I would relent and help him with the puppy. I still kept my face firmly to the front. The machine came chugging along. Then suddenly it increased speed and went sailing past. The boy's head was half turned over his shoulder, away from me, to escape the sting of the rain. The haversack was slung round his neck and resting in front of him. He gave no backward look. With the tears streaming down my face, I tramped on, past miles of withered bracken, lashed by the rain, the salt tears trickling into my mouth. The road went on, and I was the only moving thing. I felt as though I was going mad. That evening I sat in my cubicle, stifling my sobs, and wrote a long letter to Ronald, telling him I was sorry I'd been so mean. Agnes, over the partition wall, heard sounds of my distress, and called out, "What's up, P.T.?" She came into my room, and I told her the story. When I had finished, she said, "Well, don't you go and say you're sorry. It's his place to apologize. You wait till he writes to you." So I tore up my letter and put the bits into the waste paper basket. At home for the Christmas vacation, I lay in wait for the postman at every delivery in vain. Then one day my sister called, "Hey Phil, here's a letter from Ronald." I almost fell down the stairs, but it was only a Christmas card in an unsealed envelope, and when I turned it over, I saw that he had written on the back of it, "There was one left over." He was laughing at me again. I tossed my head indignantly, but that afternoon I bought a chocolate dog and sent it to him. The spring term began on the last Friday in January. On Saturday morning, after breakfast at the hostel, I gathered my books and lingered as long as I dared, waiting for the mail before going across to college. My luck was in. There was a letter for me, an important-looking envelope addressed in an unfamiliar hand with a Sheffield postmark. I sprinted across the hockey pitch, clutching my precious letter. This, of course, would be the promised invitation from his uncle. I should see Ronald again, perhaps tonight, but at any rate tomorrow. I joined in the singing of the morning hymn with a joyous heart, cherishing the very feel of the letter throughout prayers. And when we dispersed to our lecture rooms, I slipped first into the cloakroom to snatch a quick look at its contents. I opened the flap and read the first line. The next moment I was flat on the floor, like a marionette whose strings have been suddenly severed. It seemed as if my limbs had indeed turned to pieces of string, and would no longer support me. Someone passing the open entrance to the cloakroom called out, "What's the matter with P.T.?" and several girls ran in. Irene and Catherine squatted on the floor beside me. "What's up, P.T.?" they asked, but I could not speak. With a movement of my head, I indicated the letter lying on the floor. Irene picked it up and read slowly, "Dear Phyllis, I regret I have to inform you that my nephew Ronald died on Tuesday." There was a subdued groan from the people gathering round. Irene read on. "Shortly after Christmas, he developed pneumonia." They got me to my feet and took me to Matron. On the way, all I could do was to keep repeating, "It's not true, of course, it's not true. This is somebody's idea of a joke." Matron's first question was, "Were you engaged to him?" "No, I wasn't engaged to him." Then why was I making all this fuss? And anyhow, it wasn't true. After I had spent half an hour or so on Matron's couch, I went back to college, but at the end of the morning I did not wait for dinner. I set off, uninvited, to find the address, which was inscribed at the top of the letter. I must know the truth. His aunt said sadly, yes, it was true, she had been ill herself when she had received an emergency call from the doctor in Lancashire, and she had gone immediately. She had been too late. A motherly nurse in attendance had told her of Ronald's last hours. He had begged to have his puppy in his room, but the doctor would not allow it. when he was dying, she had cradled his head on her bosom, and he had said, uncomplainingly, that it did not matter to anyone whether he lived or died. This was more than I could bear. I left the house and stumbled blindly along the quiet avenue. A silent scream began to pierce my heart, and the agony went on and on. Chapter 16. A Cool Customer. When I came back to the hostel, I found that the girls appeared to be avoiding me. I heard them whispering to each other remarks such as, "Better not say anything about it, it'll upset her," or "Give her time and she'll forget it." Though some of them looked at me with an expression of mute sympathy, Agnes, however, made a more practical contribution to the easing of my grief. "I've put a book on your desk, Phil," she called out when she heard me come in. "It helped me a lot when I lost my brother." I found the book lying open. It was a collection of Robert Louis Stevenson's essays. I began to read it at the passage marked, which was an extract from an essay on the sudden death of a young man. In the hot fit of life, a tiptoe on the highest point of being, he passes at a bound to the other side. The noise of the mallet and chisel is scarcely quenched. The trumpets have hardly done blowing, when trailing with him clouds of glory, this happy-starred, full-blooded spirit shoots into the spiritual land. I repeated over and over again the words quoted. The hope of their message illuminated the darkness of my despair, and I was dumbly grateful to Agnes. 2 other brief quotations helped me. I came across them in my study of the Golden Treasury, and the words burned themselves into my brain. One of them referred to those immortal dead who live again in minds made better by their presence, and the other was, "So we inherit the sweet purity for which we struggled, failed, and agonized. As saved by the necessity to get on with my studies, I went on with the tedium of living. I was beset with problems to which I could find no solution. Why must I suffer the torture of knowing that Ronald had died believing himself unloved? Why had my parents and teachers led me to believe that there was something sinful about the yearnings of my body? Why had no one told me that the tender intimacies between young people were entirely good, so long as they each respected the other's personality? And why, oh why, if this was to be the end of it, had God first brought about my acquaintance with Ronald? We were not articulate, as a family, about the things which we felt deeply, but I wrote a letter to my mother in which I tried to express a little of my sense of loss. She wrote back sympathetically, but told me I must not be morbid, and my sister, to whom I had not revealed my inner feelings about Ronald, when she heard of his death, could only remark, "It's a good thing you weren't in love with him." So the sorrow which longed for recognition and expression became locked more deeply within me. It soon became necessary for me to think about applying for a teaching post, in the anticipation that the July examinations would be successfully weathered. I longed to teach in a village school. with rambler roses round the door, the door, but my father advised me to apply initially for a post in a city school, and then, when I was more experienced, if I still hankered for a country life, to take a village headship, as he himself had done. When I said that I did not want to become a head mistress, even my mother was shocked at my lack of ambition. I sent in an application to the City of Nottingham Education Committee, which was accepted without even the formality of an interview. I still took part in wolf cub activities in the holidays. The scoutmaster, more perceptive perhaps than my family, gave me a puppy, a boisterous little fellow, part Irish Terrier, which I promptly christened Jim, after Ronald's puppy. He was not very popular at home because of his tendency to express his exuberance by digging up the choicest rose bush in the garden. Our friends also objected to his tendency to sneak off to their house, which was half a mile away, and collect an egg from their hen pen, which he would lay on his own doormat. But I loved him dearly, and when I found that the lady with whom I was to live in Nottingham was prepared to have him there, I joyfully took him with me. There were 4 of us in the digs, all girls newly out of training college, appointed to post in city schools. Rebecca, Marjorie, and 2 Phyllises. Since the other Phyllis declined to use her middle name, which was Clara, I agreed to use mine, which was Mary. I came to like this name very much. When people called me Mary, I felt quite a different person. I had assumed that my colleagues in the digs would be as eager as I was to leave the noise of the traffic for the silence of the woodlands at the weekends, but I found they had more sophisticated interest. The need to exercise Jim then became my excuse for going alone on country rambles. I would carry him up to the top deck of the tram and hide him under the seat until we came to the terminus at Trent Bridge or at the village of Wilford. Then we would walk through the fields alongside the river or out to Clifton Grove and come back with armfuls of hazel catkins or chestnut boughs to decorate my classroom during the following week. Soon I loved my little dog more than anyone or anything. My first post as a trained certified teacher was in Scotland Place School, Nottingham, a red brick building all on one level, surrounded by streets and houses and trolley buses. The members of the teaching staff were all women. The one nearest my own age was a country parson's daughter, who astonished me one day by asking brightly, "Well, Phyllis Mary, what's your philosophy of life?" "My philosophy of life," I repeated. "I don't know. I don't think I have one." I thought a moment. Then I said, "I would say that I believe that if we do not discipline ourselves as we go through life, then discipline will be sent down as a heavenly dispensation." "Do you, Bejove?" she commented. There were, however, other conclusions which I had arrived at. With regard to prayer, for instance, it must be, I thought, that to ask God for something is not enough by itself. Our prayer may appear to be granted, but then the devil may get his foot in at the door. And if we are ready to submit so easily, He may persuade us to curse God. In making a petition, I thought, we must also ask that what God grants may prove to be a blessing to us. I was to go home to Scunthorpe by train at Christmas time. The journey would involve 2 changes of train, at Sheffield and at Doncaster, and a wait of 20 minutes or so at each of these stations. Loaded with luggage and parcels and flustered by the crowds, I decided when we came to Sheffield that I would let Jim off the lead to lessen the risk of tripping people up. I had trained him almost to walk to heel, so as I stepped out of the carriage, I unfastened his lead. Immediately Jim vanished. When the crowd had thinned, I called and whistled. I searched the platform and crossed the bridge to look on the other platforms. In vain. He had disappeared, and no one had seen him. Leaving my cases in the charge of a porter, I went out into the dark night and the unfamiliar streets and hunted for him. Over the wall which bordered the approach road to the station, there was a fairground with merry-go-rounds and blaring music. I thought, that's where he is. The gypsies have taken him, and I went among the elbowing crowds. My search was fruitless. I returned to the station. My connecting train had already left. I sat on a platform seat and tried to compose my mind so that I could think what to do next. Nobody knew where Jim was. Nobody, God knew. Then I would make an appeal to God. I sent up another desperate SOS, asking God to lead me to Jim, and promising that I would make my mind empty of all thought, so that his instructions could filter into it. I set off again, out of the station exit. My steps were impelled down the same road, with the Christmas fair over the wall. At the bottom of the road, however, instead of turning into the fair, I went straight on. Ahead of me, in the darkness, I saw what looked like black barricades, with here and there a streak of yellow light, showing underneath them. A noise of the movement of people came from beyond. The sinister shadows daunted me, but still I knew that I had to explore this unknown. I crossed the road and found that the barricades were the screens behind market stalls, beyond which the seething crowds of Christmas shoppers were circulating. Hissing gas lamps lit up the evergreens and the tinsel, and rows of Christmas poultry hung from the beams. Suddenly I saw Jim, sitting, drooling beneath the turkeys. I called his name sharply, and he gave a brief turn of the head and a wag of his tail, as if to say, "Where have you been all this time?" With a full heart I stooped down and fastened the lead, and took him back to the station, overwhelmed again by this further proof that God was concerned with my insignificant little worries. In the spring, Jim developed hysteria, much to my alarm. One night, shortly after an attack, he asked to be let out. I was too busy preparing lessons to accompany him, and I did not know that the gate was open. He never came back. During the night there was a violent storm, with thunder and lightning, and I lay in bed imagining Jim, perhaps injured by a car, or running round in circles, frightened and lost. Throughout Sunday I searched for him, visiting dogs' homes and RSPCA kennels. In vain. I wondered if all through life I was destined to go on losing the things I loved. By the year 1931, the 4 of us who had been in digs together were dispersed. I had been transferred to a post in Trent Bridge Junior School at the far side of the city. Here I had a set of eager little boys with whom I played football and cricket on the green embankment of the river. Rebecca and I went into rooms in West Bridgeford. When the summer came, we moved again into a houseboat right on the River Trent, and this spelt bliss to me. We were wakened every morning by the dawn chorus of bird song, and while the mist was still on the surface of the water, we rowed across the river to catch the train to town, coming home again in the evening when the water was deep and calm and cool and the air heavy with the scent of May blossom. Later, in the darkness, we would sit on our little deck and listen to the voices from the other boats, hidden round the curve of the bank, or to the whoosh of the oars in a passing skiff, where the glowing tip of a cigarette gave the only other indication of its occupancy. All this proximity to nature made me intensely happy, but after a few weeks of it I developed appendicitis and was sent home to Scunthorpe. By the time I returned after the operation, my place in the houseboat had been taken by another girl, and I had to go looking for digs again. I now found lodgings in a roomy house with a lady who was almost totally deaf. We were the only two occupants of the house. I had a furnished bedroom and sitting room to myself for a very modest charge. These were the post-depression years, and pounds, shillings, and pence were in short supply, and life became grim with loneliness. During the week I was occupied with my work. There was always the necessity to prepare lessons, and mark books, and make teaching apparatus, and the after-school hours could be gainfully filled. But the long, empty weekends dragged themselves out. It seemed that Nottingham people were totally uninterested in the welfare of the young women who came to work there. In fact, in a community where women were in a heavy majority, an unattached female was an object of suspicion. One might achieve membership of a tennis club on a monthly basis at a reduced rate of fees, but nobody made any effort to see that one met other members or had a fair share of games with good players. Still anxious to serve the community, and not realizing that for my own good I ought to seek more mature society during my leisure hours, I had taken up cubbing again, as a Kella of the wolf cub pack, in the parish of St. Nicholas, right in the heart of the city. The homes in which these boys lived were strung together in cramped little streets, scheduled for slum demolition. It became my aim to get the children out into the country. Their lack of knowledge about natural history was abysmal. One summer evening, as we came out of the parish room, I looked up at the house martins, swooping and screaming above the roofs. "Look up," I exclaimed. "What are those birds?" I was prepared to receive the answer, swallows. But when one of the boys said pigeons, I was appalled. I found that they knew only two sorts of birds, pigeons and chickens. We went out into the country as often as we could, but few of them were able to bring money for their bus fares, and I was not always affluent enough to pay for them. On Saturday afternoons and evenings, and on Sundays after church, the long hours stretched emptily before me. I set out to fill them with some sort of creative effort, choosing an afternoon tea cloth to embroider for my mother. It had the full willow pattern design on each of the 4 sides. Working with only 2 silk threads at a time instead of 4, and using 5 different shades of blue, I embarked on my task. As I sewed, thoughts churned round and round in my mind, and I wrestled to fit them into a pattern of rhythm and rhyme in order to produce a poem about something which had moved me deeply. I soon found in Nottingham of the 1930s that though conventional introductions to members of the opposite sex were so hard to come by, the other sort were only too easily available. When, in the early days, I would come home and tell the other girls in the digs about some unexpected encounter with a stranger, they would accuse me of having given him the come-hither look, saying that such things never happened to them. I came to the conclusion that I perhaps gave people the wrong impression, owing to my short-sightedness. I had difficulty in recognizing the features of a person on the other side of the street, and if someone gazed at me, I had to look searchingly back at him to see if he was a former acquaintance, from Scunthorpe, for instance, where lots of people knew me because I was Mr. Taylor's daughter. It was easy enough to deal with the obvious fraud, the man who stepped out of an alley and said, "Hello, Florrie. It's a long time since I saw you." But if an apparent stranger started a conversation with me, I had to make sure that he was a stranger. I had already discovered one of my mistakes. On my way to catch the trolley bus for school, I used to pass a circle of rustic seats round a reservoir thoughtfully provided by the city council for the comfort of old people in the neighborhood. On sunny days, these seats would be occupied by odd couples of rheumaticky old men, and full of the joy of youth. As I tipped past, I would generally give them a smile and a cheerful greeting. After a time I found that instead of sitting on separate seats, they would congregate all squashed together on the seat which was directly in my path, and compete with each other in returning my greeting. One day, when I was on my way back to school after dinner, I was surprised to see one of the old men waiting apparently for the same bus that I intended to take. I gave him a rather pallid smile, and he sidled up to me and asked, out of the side of his mouth, if I liked going to the pictures. Unwilling to hurt his feelings by ignoring him, I nodded. He then suggested that we should go and have a bob's worth of dark. I hurriedly jumped on my bus and decided that I would make no more overtures to old men. One Saturday evening in the autumn, I was returning by train with other members of the team from an away hockey match. There was one man in the carriage. The rest were all girls, and our conversation was flowing freely. At the last station before Nottingham, all the other girls got out, and I was left alone with the man. He soon resumed the conversation. "Do you work in Nottingham, miss?" he asked. I nodded. "Live in digs?" "Yes," I replied. "Bed-sitter?" I looked at him and decided to change the subject. "Do you work in Nottingham?" I asked. "Well, I travel. Silk stockings." "Oh," I said, sitting up with interest. "And ladies' underwear," he added. "Want a free sample?" "Yes, please," I replied. "I'll come round to your place and try them on," he said. Then he added with a leer, "Guess it wouldn't be the first time." The jolting train was drawing into the station. I stood up. "It certainly would," I exclaimed. He opened the door of the still-moving train, jumped out, and scuttled up the station platform like a frightened rabbit. One evening I was posting a letter at the General Post Office in town when I was jostled by a man. I looked at him, and he raised his hat with an apology. I posted my letter and then set off at a brisk pace towards the Derby Road. It was a light evening, but the weather was cold. Suddenly a voice behind me said, "Hell, you're in a hurry." The man who had jostled me was now walking beside me. I said, "I don't think I know you." "Well, that's soon remedied," the man replied. "Do you always walk as fast as this?" "I'm cold," I said. "Where's your friend tonight?" he asked. I said, "She's busy." "What about your boyfriend?" I shrugged my shoulders. "Perhaps you don't like men." I kept on walking. "Do you?" "Yes," I said again. "Do you go out with them?" "Sometimes," I said. There was a pause. Then he asked, "Do you go the whole hog?" I stopped walking and turned to look at him, saying, "No, I most emphatically do not, whatever the whole hog may mean." He grunted. "Then I think we can part without loss of respect on either side. Good evening," and raising his hat again, he turned and walked back the way we had come. Well, I thought to myself, of all the cool customers. At last I found a society which satisfied my artistic yearnings, as well as giving me a sense of belonging. This was the Nottingham Philodramatic Society, which carried on all activities of a little theatre in premises which had been converted from two small houses. I had neither talent nor inclination for acting, but the smell of grease paint intoxicated me, and I was thrilled to be given such elementary tasks to perform as that of turning the wind machine behind the scenes, or serving coffee during the interval. Now I had somewhere to go on Friday evenings, where I could mix with other young people, and though I was never able to throw off my self-consciousness and become the life and soul of the party, I could enjoy the conversations of the others, and delight in the skill of producers, stage managers, and actors alike. It was after a lecture at the Philo, as the dramatic group was called, that I wrote to the town clerk of the town of Great Malvern, in Worcestershire, and asked him to send my parents information about property available in the district. My father was to retire this year, and my mother longed to return to her own country. As a result of this, they visited the town and obtained a very pleasant house in West Malvern, with an extensive view over woods and valleys to the far-off Welsh mountains, and at the back a pretty garden, whose gate opened directly onto the hill. My father retired from his post as headmaster of Crosby Boys' School in the year 1933, after a quarter of a century of happy service there. Mother was now very well, having recovered completely from the cancer operation which had frightened us all so much a few years earlier, and my sister and I rejoiced to know that our parents could now look forward to reaping the rewards they so thoroughly deserved.